Hi everyone, I am Jess and I am a serial book skimmer. Not all books, some books I read cover to cover, and even the books I skim, not the entirety of the book. But I do be skimming all the time in books, and I still think that counts as reading. I still believe I have fully read the book and I haven't missed any nuance, and I am here to defend that premise. First of all, skimming is not an arbitrary technique for me that I just kind of haphazardly picked up along the way to get through books faster. It was taught to me in school at a fairly early age, I want to say 3rd or 4th grade, specifically as an accommodation for some of my learning disabilities. As a kid, I was highly resistant to learning this technique because I felt like every single word in the story mattered, and like if I wasn't reading every single word like all the other kids were, I wasn't really reading. And my teachers argued a couple of points here. First of all, I happen to have a pretty high reading comprehension, so my brain would accurately fill in a lot of gaps and nuance that other kids needed all the words for. And I realize this isn't true for everyone, but in my specific case, I had an issue with dyslexia and like a reading line tracking issue. So I really struggled with the actual act of reading, but like if you had given me pictures to tell a story or whatever, I could order them very quickly for you. Skimming is not going to be a technique for everyone, but in my case, that's part of what made it a very good technique for me. And the other thing is the sheer length of time it took me to read stories was a problem. And yes, I could get accommodation for like extended time to read or extended time to take tests to sort of help accommodate for this, but that would hold me back from being able to do group discussions like when the homework was to read these 3 chapters. If I needed more than one night to read those 3 chapters, I couldn't participate in those discussions. And having those discussions and that element of media literacy and conversation about books was more important than me actually reading every single word on the page. And like further, my teachers assured me that if I wanted to go to college, then I would need to learn to skim because the sheer volume of books that all of my various classes would assign me for reading would make it impossible for me to read every single word on the page. And the sooner I learned how to skim and pick up the core details through skimming, the better my experience in education would be going forward. This is all a long way to say I have a personal stake in whether or not skimming counts as reading or whether or not you really understand a book you skimmed, and also to sort of illuminate how this is a more serious conversation that can impact people in ways that perhaps not everyone is thinking about when they're responding to some comments about how a person does or doesn't skim. And in the kindest, most respectful way, I do think the way that people are bringing up skimming to be a little bit ableist. I would never have gotten a bachelor's degree in English if I hadn't learned how to skim appropriately and utilize that technique to get me through my schooling. That's not going to be true for everyone. I'm sure some people who struggle with the reading comprehension part but have no problem with the visual line tracking of reading need every single word. And I think whether or not you need to skim or can skim can vary from story to story as well as from like brain processing power to brain processing power. Like there is a lot of complex factors at play in whether or not you can skim a book and quote unquote understand it. But that's also why I think these generalities aren't helpful. Like if you think there's a specific text you need to read every single word for because all of it has weight and meaning and nuance and otherwise you don't really understand the thing you're talking about, then talk about that. Or if someone gives you a review after saying they skimmed it and you don't think that's accurate because they missed paragraphs that gave them information, talk about that. But do not come to me and say that only reading the conversation in various books means that you didn't read the book. Because for quite a few like paranormal romances, contemporary romances, like books like this where the world is more or less like our world, there's a lot of heavy repetition in the narrative, it goes on overly long. Really, all of the plot points can be captured through reading the conversation. When I searched on YouTube, when I searched on Google, is skimming reading, what came up were a bunch of academic resources on how to skim appropriately and on different things you should look for while skimming so that you get a full comprehensive look at a text. All of this indicated to me that even though it's been a long time since I've been part of the academic community, they're still using this technique and consider it fully reading. And I know that some people might say, well, skimming in an academic setting is because of the sheer volume of course load and amount of books you have to get through. When you are reading for pleasure or reading for enjoyment, it's different. But I mean, not necessarily. Once you get used to a certain speed of consuming information, a certain kind of like jumping from paragraph to paragraph, it becomes sort of like a natural born inbuilt talent. And if if you were reading something fictionally where the author hasn't done a great job editing or constructing the story, which arguably is a thing we are talking about a lot in modern storytelling, that they're just not going through developmental edits or normal edits at the clip they should be. Not to mention if you're reading a lot of self-published where they can't manage to afford those edits or afford that extra time because they're trying to keep afloat. All of that leans very heavily into skimming being the appropriate way to consume the story. Like, I as a reader might have an obligation to make sure I'm getting enough of the story to understand what's going on, but I would say the author also has an obligation to make every single scene and word and interaction matter. And if they haven't effectively done that, I don't see why I need to waste my time reading each line, every outfit, every time we see the same scene from a different perspective where the perspectives are not that different. I would just say, like, if you need to read every word, that is fine. I totally think you're reading and comprehending, but not everybody needs to do that, especially not with all books. And lastly here, I would highlight that reading just the dialogue is actually one of the suggested skimming techniques. On the writer side of things, people are actually talking about how to streamline dialogue and streamline paragraph breaks for skimmers because this is such a common technique. And like, if you know this is how they're teaching you to skim, then you should be making your text streamlined for skimming. Very few people actually skim an entire book. Like, if they do, good for them, fine. I do think people take the like, I only read the dialogue line a little too literally, because like in a lot of casual conversations for most genres, I might also say that I only read the dialogue. But usually what I mean by that is like, I started the book in earnest, reading every single word. I found the writing bad, difficult to get through, heavily repetitive, but not like difficult in that it was challenging, because if that's the case, I usually tandem audio read and visually read so that I can get the most from every single word. So through a desire to still finish the book and be able to have a conversation about the book, I started skimming. And usually I'll start by reading first lines of paragraphs and devolve into reading pretty much only the dialogue. Because at least when they're having a conversation, I'm getting like reactions from the characters and stuff. So if the events are the same, the reactions are maybe different. Likewise, most of these books, they talk about the events that happened just previously. So now I haven't wasted time reading pages, firsthand accounts, and I can just get the verbal summary here in the dialogue. But like, if I hit a conversation where I don't understand what's going on, I back up a few pages and start reading again so I can have fuller context. It's not like I just only read the dialogue and only get that from there on out. If that is the case, the book was really poor quality. And I can express a bunch of reasons why it wasn't really worth my time and why I probably shouldn't have finished it, period. But that is a whole separate conversation. But other stuff I'm more likely to skim than read is like epigraphs. You're lucky if I even bother to skim an epigraph, to be honest with you. The only time I read those is if I'm listening to an audiobook or if I am intentionally reading a book that I know I'm gonna do like a longer video about, then I'll try to read the epigraph and incorporate that into my review. Prologues, this is really common in fantasy and science fiction, and I kind of think it's cheating. And generally like a sign of bad writing where you do not trust your reader, because otherwise you'd start them at the meat of the story without giving them this long exposition, whatever, to set them up for like understanding the world they're about to embark in. And like, from my perspective, a prologue pretty much tells me up front you couldn't write a good chapter 1. So you took a ton of information you thought I needed to know and shoved it into this prologue and then made me read this slop first. With rare exceptions, I refuse to read prologues, and I have never been confused because I skipped them. Also, I tend to skim the few first chapters of a book sometimes. What usually happens is I read the first couple pages of the first chapter in earnest, and if it's very slow, it's not going anywhere, it's not driving to whatever the summary pitch was, I just start flipping through chapters until I get to the point where we're at the pitch meeting for the back. And sometimes that's only a few pages, sometimes that's chapters and chapters. I have skimmed all the way through a third of a book before they got to the point that was interesting in the summary. And honestly, I think the book I did that with is lucky that I decided to flip through the pages to actually read it when it got to its promised proposition, because most people would have just put the book down and not finished it at all. I also tend to skim steamy scenes. I usually try to read the first one in earnest to see what the description of these scenes is like, and sometimes I read the second one to see if there's any variation. But after that, that, especially if I see that they're just going to follow the same format and structure, I start skimming and waiting till we get to like actual important pivotal moments of the story. Dual perspectives, I always start by reading out both perspectives, but if the characters are too similar, if you're just rehashing the same thing and there's not even like a difference of opinion, thoughts, viewpoint, if they're not seeing something the other character didn't see, I'm going to read the one perspective that's most interesting to me and skip the other one. A lot of stuff in sequels and series, so for whatever reasons, when people write series books, they usually put in a bunch of like recaps on what happened in the last book or like past history that you would be familiar with if you'd read previous books. And I'm not here to reread that stuff or relitigate it. There's a couple exceptions to this, like for example, the vampire Lestat actually rewrites what happens in Interview with a Vampire and tells it from a for real different perspective that puts an honest different spin on things, which made that whole book very captivating and interesting and reframed things so that we could go forward with Lestat as the main anti-hero of the series. But if you're not doing that, then I'm not here to read your recap. Like, great that it's here for people who need it, but I don't need it or want it. Repetition and like full outfit descriptors and stuff, like there are just a lot of unnecessary things that writers include that bore the living crap out of me. If your outfit isn't functionally based on what you're doing, I don't care. Maybe one or two descriptions so that I get an idea of like who you are or how you're presenting in a scene if that's different than maybe as expected, but I don't need a full paragraph. I do not want a full paragraph pretty much ever. Same with repetition, like if we experience an event with a character and then the character goes and tells the other characters line by line what we just experienced with them, and then later down the road they run into some more characters and they tell them exactly about that same event again, that drives me crazy. Also using the same line phrasing over and over again. I understand emphasis and repeating themes, but if you're not saying something interesting, doing something dynamic with it, after a certain point in time it's like, I get it and I do not care. Can we just move on with what's going on? And that leads me into like what I think is more key here is the duty that authors have to readers. If they want me or anyone to read every word in the book, then it should all be important. And the truth of the matter is that's just not how books are written nowadays. Having more length in your book means that you have given more value. It means you get more page flips on Kindle Unlimited. There's a whole bunch of incentives to be as wordy as Charles Dickens was back in the day. And Charles Dickens, FYI, is another author that you could skim through quite happily and get the gist of what's going on. Like everything I've complained about is a failing of the author and within the author's control. And you know, to be fair, maybe I'm not the target audience of every single book I read and maybe that's the issue, but generally I would say if they did a better job with their developmental edits, if they did a better job with their writing style and cleaning it up, then I personally would be less likely to skim and might even be forced to read every word to understand the story. But as that is not the case in modern work or even in a lot of classic literature, I don't understand why people are saying if you skim, if you only read dialogue, you didn't understand the story. I don't know, I sort of see it as a form of book snobbery or a key misunderstanding about why people skim, how they go into a reading experience, what they want out of that experience. Like, as a bookish content creator at this point in time, part of what I am trying to do is stay current with reading trends and stuff. So I need to get through books or I need to decide to DNF books. And I am trying on one side to be better about putting a book down and just deciding it's not for me, which should quote unquote reduce skimming. I'm not just reading purely for enjoyment at my own pace. There is sort of a quote unquote schedule. And as a result of that, sometimes that means I have to skim, especially if I have a more in-depth book project where I need to keep rereading certain parts of the book and cross-referencing and stuff. That book takes heavy precedence and this other book over here ends up getting skimmed through. And maybe there is a valid conversation to be had about people who are skimming books, not really enjoying the book, and therefore maybe putting it down and finding something they like better. But like, if you keep picking up books and you keep not really liking them or whatever, eventually it gets demoralizing and you just want to finish something to finish something. And if the way you do that is through skimming because that's the way you get the most enjoyment, then I think that's what you should do. And I think the skimming conversation sort of loops back to a larger conversation about how we kind of need to look within ourselves and critically ask why we care so much about how other people are reading or policing whether or not they really read or understand a book. Like, their review and their commentary on that book should make it self-evident whether or not they read and understood the book. You know, does dunking on random people somehow validate your own reading or your own pacing? Are you embarrassed to be clumped in with them but not reading like them? Are you trying to gain credibility or authority in a conversation over this other person because you quote unquote read every word when they skimmed? And I've kind of tried to hang back in this conversation because I've been sort of confused by it. It feels like a lot of people in the bookish space that I like and respect are upset when people say they're skimming while reading, and I've been trying to understand their point of view, but honestly I just don't get it. And to me it does come off as like snobbish and like a you problem, that you can't skim and get enough comprehension on the book. But that's just going to be my general take. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time in the background, like both why people wouldn't like skimming, why I do skim, why other people might skim, you know, the whole 9 yards. I hope this is given a little bit more of like an all sides kind of presentation. If you agree with me, if you disagree with me, let me know in those comments down below, because I would love for someone to explain the skimming is not reading conversation in a way that I understand. And the secret emoji for getting this far is going to be a magnifying glass. And as always, keep reading.